Hello, I'm Footlong Tomahawk Productions, and today we will be talking about the Battle of Groton Heights, one of the most overlooked and probably forgotten about major battles of the American Revolution. Our story begins on September 5th, 1781. British General Benedict Arnold, who actually was from Norwich, Connecticut, about 20 miles north of where this story is actually going to be taking place, is ordered to take a fleet of 32 ships and sail along the Connecticut coast to the port of New London. New London, in Connecticut specifically, was very much a privateer port. A lot of privateers were there, and they wreaked havoc upon British supply lines. Well, of course, the British forces aren't necessarily going to like that, so they send Arnold on this raid. Arnold sails from New York, and he sails from New York under the cover of darkness, and he intends to be in New London. We'll draw a rough diagram of the Thames here. He intends to land here at New London, and he intends to also be able to quickly overwhelm Fort Trumbull, which is not so much of a fort as it is just a simple redoubt with a couple of cannons, and Fort Griswold, which was the larger of the two forts and where the actual battle itself takes place. However, when Arnold intends to actually be able to land his forces approximately here and here, he cannot do that. By dawn, he's only made it so far as to here and here, because the wind is working against him in this scenario, which actually becomes kind of detrimental and gives the Americans a lot more time to gather the forces that they were able to gather. So Arnold is forced to land his 1,600 men, split up into two columns, so 800 men on each side of the river. He's forced to take his men. He actually takes the column that is going to attack New London, while Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery and I believe Lieutenant Colonel Eyre of the 40th and 54th Regiments are attacking the Fort Griswold right here. So, at Fort Griswold specifically, a man named Rufus Avery is standing sentry post, looking out for the enemy. When he sees the British fleet, he orders 2 guns fired, but this actually signals, 2 guns actually signals enemy, while 3 signals for a privateer returning home. Arnold, actually having known this, was expecting the Americans to fire these 2 cannons, and as such, he fires a signal cannon of his own, basically creating a diversion and making a lot of these Americans who think who maybe thought there was something going on hearing the cannon firing. So bang bang, oh, something going on, bang, oh no, just a privateer. Alright, back to farming. So that's pretty much what happened with a lot of these American forces that were available. However, some actually did report for duty. About 140 or so, maybe about 130, end up at Fort Griswold under the command of Colonel William Ledyard, who actually is killed at the battle. We'll get into that later. And about 20 or so actually rally at Fort Trumbull. So these 2 columns begin advancing through the Thames riverbank, and upon seeing this, the men at Fort Trumbull actually spike their guns. Now, I'll put a link down in the description for a video about what spiking the guns actually is, but basically they sabotaged their own cannons. And then the 20 men or so actually took rowboats, and they rowed across the river to assist in the defense of Fort Griswold. So now Colonel William Ledyard has about 152 men at his disposal for the defense of Fort Griswold. Fort Griswold is a star-shaped fort, like many forts of the period, and it was built in 1773, and it is armed with a decent amount of cannon. I believe, if I can draw it here. This is looking at it from the perspective of the south. So we have we have this. It is, like I said, it's a star-shaped fort. And this will come in handy later. So this is Fort Griswold. I forgot to draw the red one. Now this is it looking from the south side. When the British first advance on the fort, they approach from the south, and they also approach from the east. Lieutenant Colonel Eyre is on the east. Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery is on the south. Gunfire does break out, and the British actually start to take rather heavy casualties. So much as, I believe, 300 casualties, which is an insane number considering how there's only about 153 defenders. Meaning that, logically, each defender would have had to kill about 2 to 3 British soldiers, which is an absolutely insane number, considering the range and accuracy of muskets at the time. However, their attempts at the defense with muskets and cannon are futile, and the British actually advance upon the fort, and they manage to storm the fort's walls. Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery is actually killed by Jordan Freeman, a once enslaved free African American man, who was wielding a 10-foot trench spear. Those were actually a lot of the defenders actually were carrying these trench spears for the sole purpose of just keeping the British off the walls, and they used them to great effect. Well, Jordan Freeman actually spears Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery to death. He dies on the walls, and Fort Griswold actually still exists today, and a placard right about here actually commemorates the spot where Montgomery dies. However, even though one of their highest-ranking officials is dead, the British do not rout. They simply push in. Colonel William Ledger actually refused to surrender for a majority of the battle. However, when he does actually surrender, there are conflicting accounts of this. Some say they flew false colors. Others say that the American militiamen didn't listen to Ledyard and kept firing and trying to fight. However, whatever it is, the surrender is not accepted, and over 88 men are massacred after they have surrendered. Initially, only 3 people actually have died in the firefight that took place on the walls. Only 3 Americans, that is. So the fact that the British have speared 85 men to death with bayonets, or they shot them, is absolutely insane, and it actually is, and in Groton and New London today, it actually makes Benedict Arnold one of the most hated people in the area. So after the British take about 88 prisoner, there's 88 are dead, 50 are wounded, and then another 20 to 30 or so are taken prisoner. One is actually pardoned, and that's because he's a 12-year-old boy named William Latham, who was at the battle at the time. But among the dead is actually Colonel William Ledyard. Colonel William Ledyard was cut down by a British officer with his own sword that he had just surrendered to the British lieutenant. Colonel William Ledyard actually has his own cemetery in Groton these days. where he is, I believe he is buried there, but nonetheless, 88 men die, 50 or so are wounded, and 20 to 30 are taken prisoner. One is pardoned. And that is what happens on the Fort Griswold side. A lot of the wounded aren't necessarily taken prisoner. A lot of those wounded are actually brought down to the Ebenezer Avery house, owned by Lieutenant Ebenezer Avery, who I believe died at Fort Griswold that day. And that house is currently on the site of Fort Griswold. However, it was not there. It was a few blocks away. But they take a lot of the wounded there, and that acts as a temporary field hospital. Some of the men recover, others die, as typical for 18th century medicine. But let's move on to what happens at New London. So there's no defenders actually at Fort Griswold or at Fort Trumbull anymore. So there's not necessarily a defense of New London anymore. And with Fort Griswold falling, there certainly isn't any hope of any troops coming by or any leftover American militia who have beaten the British coming over, because they don't exist. So New London is left to the mercy of Colonel Arnold, or Brigadier General Arnold, sorry. And what actually happens is 183 buildings are burned. What happens is a powder magazine is detonated and a massive fire breaks out. A lot of the buildings in New London from the 18th century are actually post-1781 for this exact reason. Because so much of it was burned and destroyed by the British that it basically erased an entire city. It is one of the most brutal and repressive acts that happens in the North. But nonetheless, after burning New London, massacring the defenders of Fort Griswold and the like, General Arnold deems the raid over, and the British just sail on home with their 20 or so prisoners and an entire town burned. New London actually holds a festival every year or so, where they literally burn effigies of Benedict Arnold for this exact reason. This has been The Battle of Groton Heights by Flintlock Atomic Productions. As always, I'm Flintlock Atomic Productions, signing.
Hath old England of folly and sin, spited Chatham and Camden, Maryborough, Wilkes and Glyn. Not content with the Game Act, they tax fish and sea, and America drenched with hot water and tea.